Ever since I was born, Daddy has been the best father you could ever imagine. And I just wanted to say I love him so much.
Imagine a room with no mirrors. Now imagine a man who spent his entire life looking into one, only to realize the reflection was starting to move on its own. Most people think they know what kept Michael Jackson awake at night. They point to the bright lights, the crushing weight of the tabloids, the lawsuits, or the simple fear that the world would one day stop cheering. But those are surface-level ghosts. If you look closer, past the gold records, past the gates of Neverland, and into the quietest hours of his life, you find a much darker, much more intimate terror. It wasn't a fear of falling. It was the fear of being erased while he was still standing right in front of us. Michael Jackson's greatest fear was not death. It was the total loss of agency. It was the terrifying, suffocating possibility that the entity known as Michael Jackson would become a property he no longer owned, a story he no longer wrote, and a face he no longer recognized in the dark. To understand this fear, you have to go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of the fame, but the beginning of the disappearance. From the age of 5, Michael was a professional. He was a product. He learned early on that his value was tied to his performance, his precision, and his ability to please a crowd, and a father. In those formative years, the self was secondary to the show. This created a fundamental fracture in his psyche. If the world only loves the performer, what happens to the person underneath? This seed of doubt grew into a towering obsession with control. Think about the way he spoke. That soft, breathy whisper wasn't just a stylistic choice. It was a psychological shield. When you speak that softly, the world has to lean in. It has to go quiet just to hear you. It is a way of reclaiming the space around you, of forcing a chaotic, loud world to adjust to your frequency. It was his way of saying, I will set the volume of this conversation. From a very young age, Michael learned that if he didn't control his environment, the environment would consume him. He had seen it happen in the Motown days, the way the industry could take a child, polish him until he shone like a diamond, and then discard the shell the moment the glow faded. He decided, perhaps subconsciously at first, that he would never be a shell. He would become the architect of his own cage. This obsession with control manifested in his perfectionism. But perfectionism is too light a word for what Michael experienced. It was a frantic, almost religious need for absolute precision. Every snap of his fingers, every stitch on a gold-braided jacket, every single frame of a short film had to be exactly as he envisioned it. Why? Because to Michael, a mistake wasn't just a mistake was a leak. If there was a single crack in the armor, the other Michael, the one created by the press, the one hallucinated by the public, the one shaped by the ghosts of his childhood, would seep in and drown the real one. There is a specific cold kind of loneliness that comes with being the most famous person on earth. It isn't the loneliness of being alone, it's the loneliness of being a monument. People don't talk to monuments. They gawk at them. They chip away pieces of them for souvenirs. They project their own fears, desires, and hatreds onto the stone. Michael felt those hands chipping away at him every single day. He retreated into silence, not because he had nothing to say, but because silence was the only thing the world couldn't misinterpret, or so he thought. If you listen to the lyrics of songs like Leave Me Alone or Stranger in Moscow, you don't hear a pop star complaining about the paparazzi. You hear a man experiencing a profound sense of dissociation. He talks about walking in the rain just so no one can see him crying, but it goes deeper than that. He is describing a reality where his own identity has become a swift and sudden fall from grace. He was terrified that the man in the mirror was becoming a stranger, even to himself. He was watching his own life play out like a movie he wasn't allowed to direct. He built a world of his own, because the real world required him to surrender parts of himself he wasn't willing to give up. Neverland wasn't just a playground. It was a fortress of the mind. It was a place where time stood still, where the rules of the outside didn't apply. Within those walls, he was the creator, the king, and the eternal child. Outside those walls, he was a commodity to be bought, sold, and analyzed under a microscope. The gates of Neverland were meant to keep the world out, but they also kept the fear in. Think about the physical transformations. The world mocked them, studied them, and used them as punchlines. But look at it through the lens of a man who was terrified of being defined by anyone but himself. If you are afraid of losing control over how the world sees you, what is the ultimate act of defiance? It is to change the very canvas you were born with, to become something that nature didn't intend. It was a way of saying, "You think you know me? You think you own this face? Watch this." It was a desperate, beautiful, and ultimately tragic attempt to remain the master of his own image, even as that image became more and more ethereal. But the more he tried to grip his identity, the more it seemed to slip through his fingers. The psychological tension of being Michael Jackson was the tension of a man trying to hold water in his cupped hands. The tighter he squeezed, the faster it disappeared. He became a prisoner of his own myth. He was afraid that if he stopped being the king, there would be nothing left underneath. No Michael, just a void. This fear of the void is what drove his tireless work ethic, even when his body was failing him. If he wasn't creating, he wasn't existing. If he wasn't the greatest, he was nothing. There was no middle ground for Michael Jackson. To be average was to be invisible, and to be invisible was to be dead. He was terrified of the silence that would follow the final applause. That fear followed him into the recording studio, where he would spend weeks on a single drum sound. It followed him onto the stage, where he would perform through agonizing pain just to ensure the illusion remained intact. And eventually, it followed him into the medicine cabinet. He wasn't looking for a high. He was looking for a way to turn off the noise. He was looking for a way to stop the constant scanning, the constant vigilance, the constant fear that someone somewhere was planning to take another piece of him. In those final years, the silence around him grew deafening. He had reached a point where he couldn't trust his own shadow. He was a man who had conquered the world, only to find that the world was now living inside his head, demanding more, judging more, and slowly replacing his heartbeat with the sound of a camera shutter. He was haunted by the idea that he had become a caricature, a figure of folklore, rather than a human being. Consider the footage we have of him when he wasn't performing, the moments when he thought the cameras were off or when he was simply existing in a room. There is a tension in his shoulders, a darting quality to his eyes. He was a man who was always being watched, but more importantly, he was a man who was always watching himself being watched. This is a special kind of psychological torture. To never be able to simply be, to always have to curate the version of yourself that the world is allowed to see. The fear of loss of identity is what eventually isolated him from everyone. Friends became employees. Family became distant. The circle grew smaller and smaller until it was just Michael and his reflection. He was terrified that anyone who got too close would see the cracks. He was terrified that they would see he was just a man, flesh and bone, vulnerable and aging, rather than the celestial being he had spent decades constructing. When we look back at Michael Jackson, we shouldn't just see the performer. We shouldn't just see the scandals or the success. We should see the man who was running a lifelong race against a ghost, the ghost of his own celebrity. He was terrified that one day he would wake up and Michael Jackson would be everywhere, on every screen, in every song, on every t-shirt. But the human being who started it all would be nowhere to be found. He once said in an interview that he wanted to live forever through his art. But there is a dark irony in that wish. To live forever as an image is to give up the right to be a person. Michael Jackson achieved immortality, but he paid for it with the very thing he was most afraid of losing: his true self. He became a symbol, And symbols don't get to have fears or flaws or a voice that isn't scripted. Imagine the weight of that. Imagine waking up every day knowing that you are a billion-dollar brand, a global icon, a religious figure to some and a villain to others, but knowing in your heart that no one, not a single soul, actually knows the man who is brushing his teeth in the mirror. That is the fear. That is the abyss he looked into every single night. The fear that he had succeeded so well at becoming a legend that he had accidentally killed the man. And in the end, perhaps that is the most unsettling part of his story. We watched it happen in real time. We watched the fear take hold. And we watched as the mask slowly became the man. He spent his entire life trying to keep the world out, never realizing that the world had been there all along, tucked away in the very silence he used to protect himself. The fear of being forgotten is a common human experience. But the fear of being remembered as something you aren't? The fear of being a stranger in your own skin while the whole world claims to know you? That is a haunting that never truly ends. It is the legacy of a man who had everything, yet lived in constant terror of losing the one thing he could never truly hold: himself. We see this fear in his final project, This Is It. Look at the rehearsals. Even then, facing the end, he was obsessed with the details. He was terrified that the world would see him as diminished. He would rather push himself to the point of collapse than allow a version of Michael Jackson to exist that wasn't perfect. He was a slave to his own creation, bound by the fear that if the image faltered, he would disappear entirely. Think about that the next time you hear his voice. Listen past the melody. Listen past the heavy breathing and the iconic ad-libs. Listen for the man trying to find his way out of the monument he built for himself. Because in the end, Michael Jackson wasn't running toward the lights. He was running away from the shadows they cast. Shadows that looked more like him than he did. Shadows that were beginning to swallow him whole. The story of Michael Jackson is often told as a tragedy of fame, but it is truly a tragedy of identity. It is the story of a man who was so afraid of being ordinary that he became something entirely unrecognizable, only to realize that, in the process, he had lost the power to ever be ordinary again. He was trapped in the amber of his own greatness, forever visible, forever untouchable, and forever afraid of the moment the lights would finally go out and leave him alone with a self he had spent a lifetime trying to escape.